Hello, everyone. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement here at JTS. So happy to welcome you to today's session of our spring series. The series is Timely Insights, Timeless Wisdom, which is our way of saying all kinds of wonderful Torah coming from JTS on a variety of topics that are compelling in one way or another. Special welcome to anyone joining us for the first time today. And we're so pleased to have Dr. Aaron Koller, Adjunct Professor at JTS, regular professor at Yeshiva University, teaching us today. His session is called Mordecai the Jew and Esther the Greek, the Changing Politics of the Book of Esther in Antiquity and Our Times. So as part of this series, we have woven in where appropriate. I'm getting all kinds of notifications. I apologize. I'll turn them off. We've woven in where appropriate holiday-related sessions. So here we go today with our pre-Purim session. We would love to have additional sponsors for the remaining sessions in the series, and we're putting sponsorship information in the chat. And so grateful to all of you for all of the sponsorships thus far and all of your donations. And I will turn it over to Tani now.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So I'm just going to go ahead and review the format for this session. Dr. Koller will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We'll also have some time for Q&A at the end as well. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. And during the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Koller. Since we receive a lot of questions, kindly express your question both clearly, in complete sentences, and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The PowerPoint presentation for today's class was in the email that you received, and we're going to be screen sharing that as well. We're so pleased to have Dr. Aaron Koller teaching us today, Adjunct Professor of Talmud at JTS and Professor of Near Eastern Studies at Yeshiva University. Dr. Koller is the author of Unbinding Isaac, the Akedah for Jewish Thought, and also Esther in Ancient Jewish Thought, among other books, and the co-editor of 5 more. He's currently working on a cultural history of the alphabet from its invention through world domination. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Koller.
Thank you very much, Tani, and thank you, Rabbi Andelman. It's very good to be here. I will share my screen and we will jump into this material. I'm going to try to take you back in terms of intellectual history about 2,500 years. We think about the political import of the Book of Esther in its ancient context. And there are a lot of ways in which we could approach that, a lot of different issues that are raised in the Book of Esther that would have resonated or not resonated, aggravated people, annoyed people, inspired people during Second Temple history. I want to focus on a few ways in which the Book of Esther seems to be particularly antagonistic to what other Jews at the time were saying. And so what I want to posit is that the author of Esther was actually purposely challenging some of what Jews had been saying for some time. And in the second part of today's session, we'll also see that that didn't go unnoticed. And then in fact, during Second Temple times, there were Jews who responded pretty negatively to the Book of Esther for exactly the reasons that Esther was responding negatively to what other Jews were saying. So essentially what I want to put in front of you is that this is a living, breathing discussion, political, ideological, religious discussion during Second Temple history that Esther is taking part of. Often when we get the Bible, we just get the Bible. You know, there's a bunch of books, 24 conventionally, and we read them or we don't read them as we see fit. But what I want to try to encourage us to do is to see the Bible as the record of an ongoing dialogue, trialogue, quadrilogue sometimes, really vibrant conversation, trying to chart some of the biggest, most important issues of the day back then, which are, not so surprisingly, also resonant today. So I'm going to start with some of the tenets of what we might call common Judaism in early Second Temple times. So I'm not going to try to justify all of these in a lot of detail, but drawing from biblical books like the last of the prophets, Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, drawing from books like Ezra and Nehemiah, Nehemiah, drawing from books like Divrei Hayamim, Chronicles, and the book of Daniel, you get a picture of what most Jews were expecting, thinking about their lives, their experiences in the beginning of Second Temple times. So these Jews are in exile. They've been exiled in, we'll come back to the years later on, but in 586 BCE, the Babylonians destroyed the temple and exiled most of the Jews to the east, to Mesopotamia. And the story of Esther is about a century later. So they've been there for multiple generations. That's also a point we will return to soon. And there are a number of expectations and beliefs that most Jews seem to have had. One is that the legitimate leadership of the Jewish people was the dynasty of King David. King David, actually a remarkably long-lived dynasty. David himself came to the throne something like 970 or so BCE, according to the conventional chronology. So lasts about 400 years. There's some rough spots in the middle of the succession, but 400-year dynasty is actually not common in world history. So it's a remarkably long-lived dynasty. And even after the exile, some of the leadership of the Jews in exile was also scions of the Davidic dynasty. And there seems to be an expectation that if and when the Jews return to their own country with their own polity and their own capital city and their own political autonomy, they will be led by someone from the dynasty of King David. So that's point number one. Point number two, while in exile in particular, there is a real significance to endogamy. In other words, in-marrying, that Jews should marry other Jews. And we get this very explicitly in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, also in other books that are not in the Bible, that we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls and other Second Temple texts that are preserved in various other traditions, that really emphasize very, very strongly the principle that one must marry someone from a family whom one knows. Maybe one's own family, a cousin or second cousin, or another distinguished Jewish family. Endogamy is an important principle. Number three, a new exodus. In other words, exile is temporary. It's not the first time the Jews have been in exile. They looked back to the time of the sojourn in Egypt, and they knew how that ended. God came in, God brought them out, miracles, fire, brimstone, plagues, splitting of a sea, and then culminating in the return trip to the land of Israel. And that was going to be the paradigm for the future redemption too. So Jews said, look, we're in exile, we get it, we deserved it or we didn't deserve it, but we're here. And we know how the story is going to end. The story is going to end with a second Exodus. God's going to come in. It's going to be modeled on the Exodus, but maybe even better, grander than the Exodus. So that's number three. There'll be a future, a new Exodus. Number four, there's a lot of discussion in these sources about who is a Jew. What does it mean to be a Jew? Is a Jew by birth? Is a Jew by faith? It's possible, not certain, that the book of Ruth is involved in this discussion. Ruth, of course, converts to Judaism, quote unquote. I put converts in quotation marks because the sum total of her conversion is, your people is my people, your God is my God. And with that, she is now a Jew. On the other polar extreme, you have a book like Ezra, where if one cannot provide or produce a document showing one's genealogy going back some number of generations to prove that one is a pure-blooded Jew, one is not really going to be part of the Jewish community. So there seems to be a lot of discussion about who counts as a Jew? What does it mean to be a Jew? Who gets into this community? These are questions that would have been loomed a lot less large pre-exile, because at that point, Judaism was presumably something like, well, if you live in Jerusalem, or if you live in the Shvela, and you speak Hebrew, and you're paying taxes to the king of Judah, like, why would anyone question your Judaism? But once you have an exile, once you have a diaspora, suddenly things get a lot more complicated. And so we get a lot of discourse over who is a Jew. Number five, We have the centrality of the city of Jerusalem. And this is in the prophetic books, like Nehemiah, where Nehemiah lives in Susa. We're not going to come back to this, maybe I'll mention it now, in a scene worth reading as you get ready for Purim, the scene at the beginning of Nehemiah chapter 2, where he goes to the king and the king says, "What's wrong, Nehemiah? You look sad. What can I do for you? Anything you request, I would give to you." And you're like, hey, I know this story, right? This is the story of Esther, except here Nehemiah says, "Thank you so much, Your Majesty. What I would really like is to go back to the city of my ancestors. I would like to go back to Jerusalem." And the centrality of Jerusalem is something that comes up in a whole slew of texts from Second Temple times. And again, this looms larger when people are not living in Jerusalem, or at least many people are not living in Jerusalem. When Jerusalem is an idea even more than a reality, then Jerusalem starts to loom very large in the texts. And then the last point that I'll mention, which is maybe so obvious that it doesn't need to be mentioned, but of course, in the context of Esther, it really needs to be mentioned, is the involvement of God in history. And every single text takes God's involvement as a profoundly central part of Jewish history. The history of the exile, the history of life in the exile, the history of returning from exile, all of this involves divine involvement in Jewish life. I'll just give you one quick example. Daniel has a couple of the book of Daniel has a couple of stories about decrees that were made by the kings, the Babylonian kings or the Persian kings, that would have necessitated violating Jewish law. Daniel and his friends refused to violate this law. In one case, it's the most trivial of laws. Daniel just has to not pray at the window in order to accord with the decree, but he doesn't. He refuses. He prays at the window in the direction of Jerusalem. So again, going back to the Jerusalem point, and because of this, he's arrested and thrown into the lion's den. But this is not anything to fear, because for someone like Daniel, God sends angels. The angels hold the lions' mouths closed, and Daniel is saved. So Jerusalem is central. God is central. There's sort of obvious things in Jewish life that the texts take for granted. Okay. Now, in every single case that I just mentioned, the book of Esther parts ways from sort of the conventional views. And I'm going to say these up front, and then I'm going to spend the next half hour or so unpacking them, although hopefully we'll take a break in the middle for some comments and questions. But first, let me just sort of run through them, and then we'll take them one by one. So, dynasty of King David, taken for granted that's where true Jewish leadership comes from. Well, not in Esther. Actually, in Esther, the heroes are from the tribe of Benjamin, and particularly associated with King Saul, who is, of course, David's great antagonist. Number two, endogamy, the value of in-marriage. Well, Esther is literally intermarried. This is not a subtle point in the book. She is married to the king of Persia. Mordecai is not married literally. We get no information about his marriage. So there's nothing to say about that. But Esther, at least, is certainly the opposite of endogamous. Number three, will there be a new Exodus? Well, the book of Esther actually takes place on the holiday of Passover, and we'll look at those details soon. But in a sense, it's an anti-Exodus. At the end of the story, the Jews are exactly where they were at the beginning of the story. And as a line in the Talmud says, some centuries later, we're still slaves of Achashverosh. In other words, here we are still in exile. We haven't moved. So what kind of Exodus would it be that ends with us still being in exile? Number four, the question of who is a Jew? Well, there is an explicit answer to that in the book of Esther. Mordecai is a Jew. He's literally called Mordecai HaYehudi, with no connection to the tribe of Judah. And so Yehudi there actually means Jew, but what kind of connection does Mordecai have to Judaism? That's a really hard question. There's no overt Jewishness in Mordecai's life at all within the book of Esther. Number five, Jerusalem. Jerusalem is mentioned in passing once in the book of Esther. We'll come to that line in a bit, but it's not a living character. No one's in Jerusalem. It's there only in a historical flashback. And in fact, the fortress of Susa, the Bira of Shushan, is described in ways that are eerily reminiscent of the Temple of Jerusalem and the Tabernacle even, suggesting that perhaps the Susa palace and fortress as actually taking the place of Jerusalem. Again, a point that we'll return to. And last, the involvement of God. Well, of course, probably the most famous aspect, literary aspect of the Book of Esther is that God is not mentioned in the book at all. And this is something that we sometimes learn so early on in our studies of Esther that it seems like trite and we forget how crazy and radical that actually is. But it is entirely crazy and radical to have an entire book in the Bible about Jewish history that doesn't mention God once. God never does anything. God's not the subject of any verb. No character ever invokes God. No one says, this was really a sign from God or a symbol from God or the work of God. No one mentions God at all. It's as if, and I think this is true, the author was intentionally leaving God out of the story. So this is a explicit repudiation of the assumption that God is involved. God is absolutely not involved. We'll have to, again, come back to what does that mean, God is not involved. Okay, so let's take these a little bit, one at a time. Some we'll do in more detail, some in less detail, but hopefully we'll sort of unpack them one by one. So let's start with this invocation of King Saul. The introduction of the first Jewish characters in the Book of Esther, which you have on the right, doesn't happen, of course, until the second chapter of the book. The first chapter doesn't mention Jews at all. It's an interesting question that I won't pursue now. Ask yourselves, though, what would happen if I just dropped chapter 1 from the Book of Esther? Would the story change? How would the story change? What does the story gain by the inclusion of that chapter? So let's put that aside. In the beginning of the second chapter, we're told that the king needs a new wife, a queen. And then we read, Ish Yehudi haya b'Shushan habira, ushmo Mordecai ben Yair ben Shim'i ben Kish ish Yemini. There was a Jewish man in the fortress of Susa, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Yair, son of Shim'i, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. And he was raising Hadassah, she is Esther. Hopefully you can also read backwards. That introduction is very, very strikingly similar to the introduction of Saul back in 1 Samuel chapter 9, which starts, there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, son of Tzuror, son of Bechorat, son of Alphiach, a Benjaminite, a man of substance. Now, we start off just with the literary parallels. There was a man, 4 generations of ancestors, right? So it was a man, son of. They're both Benjaminites. Saul's father, as we'll find out in a minute, this is Saul's father, is named Kish. Mordecai's great-grandfather is also named Kish from the same tribe. I assume it's not the same Kish. This is only, say, a century and a quarter ago, not 6 centuries ago. And also, sorry, before we go on, and also both of them sort of introduce the quote-unquote wrong character. We don't care about Kish in 1 Samuel chapter 9. It turns out that Kish, this whole long introduction to this man named Kish, is a red herring. Kish is uninteresting for us. The next verse is going to say he had a son named Saul. And the rest of the story is, of course, about Saul. We actually, in chapter 2 of Esther, don't care about Mordecai. That's, of course, a less obvious statement, but we actually don't right now, because we were just told in verse 4 is that the king needs a wife, and they're going to collect all of the beautiful virgins from the kingdom. The fact that there was a man named Mordecai is uninteresting to us. We need to know if there is a woman. And in fact, then we're told he was raising Hadassah, that's Esther. So the structure of the 2 introductions is really very, very similar. The man with the 4 generations from the tribe of Benjamin with the name of Kish, and then we're told their relationship to the character that we actually care about. So this is clearly meant to evoke the introduction of Saul. In other words, when we read Esther, the author of Esther wanted to clue us in right at the beginning. When we meet Mordecai and Esther, think about Saul. This is going to be really important. Think about Saul. The parallels actually go on. I won't belabor this point, but you have parallels like later in chapter 2, Esther did not reveal Ein Esther Magedet, her kin or her people. Saul lo higid lo, it was not, he did not tell him. More substantively, and this I think is thematically very, very important for Esther, but not so much for our topic today. Saul loses his kingship for failing to destroy Agag, the king of the Amalekites. Mordecai and Esther succeed by defeating Haman, the Agagite, the Agagi. And I don't know of a better interpretation of Agagi than a descendant of Agag, the king of Amalek. Mordecai tells Esther she must not remain silent. Hacharish tacharishi, you must not do that. Saul, that's one of the things he exactly did early on, which led him to lose power, was that he was macharish. He would remain silent. And there are some other ones as well. I would just mention one, the banquets, which got a little conflated, but look at the bottom left corner here. So ignore the Saul Esther part here, titles here. Just look at the bottom left. There's this amazing parallel that in 1 Samuel 20, when Saul already is jealous of, suspicious of David, he hosts two feasts, because there are 2 days of celebrations. The first feast passes uneventfully. At the second feast, Saul becomes very, very angry when he finds out that his son Jonathan has been protecting his enemy David. And Jonathan then says, Kalta hara'a me'imo, which literally means the evil has been finished from him. But it's an idiom for Saul definitely intends evil. And then he gets up angrily from the feast. Now, that is amazingly similar to what we have in that plot point in Esther chapter 7, where there are 2 feasts on sequential days. The first one passes uneventfully, but at the second one, the host, Achashverosh, becomes angry when he finds out what one of the guests has been doing. And even more strikingly, we have the same phrase. Haman sees that Kalta hara'a mehamelech, that the anger has been certainly decided by the king. So the same idiom and the same plot elements. Clearly, this is meant to evoke the story of Saul. So I'm not going to read through the rest of them, but there's no doubt that the author of Esther is consciously thinking about the story of not just the character of Saul, but the story of Saul as he's composing this story. Now, Saul, we should make the obvious point. Saul has not been king since about 1000 BCE, right? There's no Saul on the throne in the last 500 and whatever number of years. So it's not a reasonable political view, like let's bring Saul back. There's no Saul to bring back. There's no Saulite dynasty to bring back. I think the reason that the author is so interested in Saul is not so much because of Saul himself. There are some elements like the Amalek connection, but there's also the fact that Saul is the anti-David. Saul is the one who didn't found the dynasty in Jerusalem. He didn't conquer Jerusalem and build the temple. And one thing the author of Esther does not want to put as the central theme of his story is Jerusalem and the temple and political autonomy in the state of Judah. That would be David. That's what David did. Saul didn't do any of that. And so Saul is the anti-David. And the author of Esther is like, I'm going back to Saul. I'm going to have leaders from the tribe of Benjamin who evoke Saul at every turn, and I'm going to have no allusions to David whatsoever. There's no connection to David in the book, whereas Saul is all over the place. Okay. So let me do one more in a little bit of detail, and then we'll take a break for some thoughts or questions. The expectation for a new Exodus. This is all over the place in the prophets who live at the end of the First Temple times and through the Babylonian exile into Second Temple times. So a dramatic example is Jeremiah chapter 16. Jeremiah says, in the future, after the redemption, no one's going to say anymore, God who brought the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, right? That's what people say today. Now people say, oh, God who brought the Israelites out of Egypt. He's like, no one's going to say that in the future. It's going to be overshadowed. It's going to be overshadowed by God who brought the Israelites out of the Northland. In other words, who brought the Israelites from Babylonia. So no one's going to talk about the Exodus anymore. People are going to talk about the return from the Babylonian exile. It's going to be so much more impressive, so much grander, that the Exodus is going to fade from memory. This is actually a topic. That line is a topic that gets addressed in the Passover Haggadah. Will we talk about the Exodus in Messianic times? Will that actually be discussed? So that's a really fascinating question. But Jeremiah is not thinking about Messianic times. He's like, in my lifetime, or maybe right after it, God will bring the Jews back from Babylonia, and that's going to overshadow the original Exodus from Egypt. Ezekiel, who works in the Babylonian exile, that's where he lives and works. He says, oh, this is coming and it's going to be great, except not for you, Jews. It's going to be great for God. Here's what's going to happen. God's going to reign over you with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, right? Totally Exodus imagery. Yad chazaka uzro netuya. And outpoured fury, right? That's like suddenly a little darker. And again, strong hand, outstretched arm, outpoured fury. I'll bring you to the desert. I'll enter into judgment with you as I did in the desert of the land of Egypt. So very, very explicit. Like in case we didn't get that references to the strong hand and the outstretched arm, he's like, it's going to be like Egypt. Right? It's going to be like the Exodus. I will enter into judgment with you. And Ezekiel, the dark, and it really is dark, twist that Ezekiel puts into this vision is that this is not actually going to be good for the Jews. It's going to be good for God, but the Jews are going to suffer terribly because they have not been faithful enough to God. But again, I'm actually not so interested in what Ezekiel does with it right now. I'm just interested in the fact that Ezekiel too expects the end of exile to come in something that's going to be like a second Exodus. Second, the prophet that we know of as Second Isaiah, which is a ridiculous name, but anyway, Second Isaiah, calls on God to do it. God said, he says, awake, awake, garb yourself in strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in the days of old. Wasn't it you who hacked Rahab into pieces? Okay, this is a myth that we don't know about, who pierced the dragon. But then, wasn't it you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a path for the redeemed ones to pass through? In other words, that's the splitting of the sea, right? Seventh day of Passover. Didn't you do that? Do it again. Let those liberated by the Lord return. Come to Zion with shouting, eternal joy on their head. And this is Ufduyei Hashem Yeshuvun, Uvaut Zion Berina, Simchat Olam al Rosham, Sason v'Simcha Yasigun, Nasu Yagon v'Anacha. Right? So he's calling on God, like, do that Exodus again, right? It was so marvelous the first time around. I know you can. Do it again. Now, what does Esther say about the Exodus? So I could give you a lot of time to think about it, but the short answer is Esther doesn't say anything about the Exodus, right? I mean, what does Esther say about the Exodus? Esther has nothing to say about the Exodus, which is accurate and inaccurate at the same time. Esther, of course, has nothing to say about the Exodus, but when we look carefully, we find out that the story of Purim takes place on Passover. And this is not like me making stuff up. It just says so. It just doesn't say the word Passover. So it says on the, oh no, my slides are wrong here. That's my mistake. It's not a formatting issue. This is a serious issue. Okay, I'll tell you in a second. Esther, chapter 3. The royal scribes are called on the first month of the 13th day. What's the first month? Not what I wrote. Not Adar. The first month is exactly Nisan. Right, so the 13th month of Nisan, the royal scribes are called, and Haman commands to send out this genocidal message. Right, so okay, go, 13th day of Nisan. Mordecai finds out about it. He goes to Esther. They have the conversation in Esther chapter 4, where Mordecai is trying to convince Esther to do something. At the end of the story, Esther says, you know what? I'll do something. Go fast for 3 days, right? Fast, the 13th day, the 14th day, the 15th day, 15th day. So actually in a midrash, not in the text, of course, but in a midrash, Mordecai responds, Esther, we can't fast the 15th day. That's Purim. No, that's not. That's Pesach. That's Pesach. We have the Seder. We can't fast. We have an important meal. We've already cleaned for Pesach. We've already koshered the kitchens. There's no way we're not having the Seder. And Esther says, Mordecai, this is actually a quote, Mordecai, you're a fool. If we don't fast this Passover, we will never have another Passover to celebrate again. The key point is the fasting goes through to Passover. They didn't celebrate Passover that year in Shushan. On the third day, Esther goes to the king and says, come to a banquet that very day. So the very first banquet is the 15th, maybe the 16th of Nisan. Again, I'm sorry that I wrote Adar multiple times on this slide. 15th or 16th day of Nisan is the first banquet. The second banquet, of course, the second day is going to be the 16th or 17th day. And that's when Haman is killed. Right? At that point, the immediate threat from Haman is actually over. So the big transition in the story, the big climax in the story, takes place literally on Passover. 15th, 16th, 17th day of Nisan, first, second, third days of Passover. That's actually when the story of Purim takes place. Of course, there's 11 months then until Haman had decreed the genocide. So what we wind up celebrating 11 months later is the war that the Jews, the defensive war, that the Jews fight against their enemies, in which they are strikingly victorious. But the actual events, most of the events of the Megillah of Esther take place on Passover. And yet, this is the anti-Passover, right? This is as far from Passover as you could possibly imagine. The Jews are still in Susa at the end of this. They haven't moved. If you think about the Exodus as God coming down and doing miracles and taking the Jews from one place back to their homeland, none of that takes place in the story of Purim. There's no God, there are no miracles, there's no movement. It's all an anti-Exodus. And I suspect that that's exactly what the author of Esther is trying to do. The author is trying to say, everyone's expecting a new Exodus. Everyone's expecting a new Passover. And let me tell you about Passover in the diaspora. If you sit there waiting for miracles and splitting seas and 10 plagues, you're going to be waiting for a very long time. But if you're looking, you can see actually redemptions in different places. They're not Exodus type redemptions. But is it not a redemption that we're all alive 1 year later after that genocidal madman Haman tried to massacre us all? So we're still here, that's true. We are literally in the same place as we were at the beginning of the story, right? If you ask, what is the Jews' situation at the end of the story compared to the Jews' situation at the beginning of the story? In that chapter 1 that doesn't mention the Jews, the answer is, it is exactly the same. They are not any better or any worse than they were at the beginning of the story. They're exactly in the same place. And the book of Esther is an anti-Exodus story, it seems to say, but in our life, in our real life here in Persia, that's redemption. I mean, the fact that we've survived another generation in relatively good health, that's amazing. That is not something to take lightly. And so we're going to celebrate that. That is worthy of a holiday. It's not the holiday that Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel were talking about with a grand Exodus. It's not that. But it is an anti-Exodus that's not actually less deserving of a celebration. So Purim is actually on Passover, but it's anti-Passover. All right, let me pause for a moment. And I think this is a good time to take stock. So if people have comments or questions to this point, maybe send this to Rabbi Andelman and take a few minutes.
That was fascinating. I've never seen all of those parallels lined up. And yeah, like you said, you're not making it up. There it is right in front of us. Okay, so related to that, in my mind, our first question was about the historicity of the text. And is there any evidence that, that a person, Esther, or a person, Mordecai, existed? To me, it seems, from what you've done, that makes us so conscious of the author and the choices he's making, and other, just other interpretations of the book showing it as a satire and all these things. It seems impossible that it's to think of it as a real historical story, but the question is for you, not for me. So
I kind of like your take on it. No, the truth is, I think that's exactly right. I think what you just said is the crux of the issue. In its current form, it's clearly a work of literature, and it's, when I've taught a semester-long course on the Book of Esther, I think if I had started and said, the Book of Esther is not historical, students would be like, what is that? How can you say that? How can you start that way? But by the end of the semester, this actually is a conversation I had with students at the end of one semester a few years ago. And I said, what do you think about the historicity? And the first student raised his hand immediately and said, well, history doesn't take place in chiastic structures, which I thought was a brilliant way of saying it, right? I mean, what we have is a work of literature. Now, is it a work of literature? We were chatting beforehand about like like the show Hamilton, which is, I don't know what percentage, but like a very, very high percentage actually matches facts. Although Hamilton is obviously a brilliant work of art, but it draws on real facts. Or is it made up out of whole cloth? So that's a harder question. I think it's obvious, as Rabbi Andelman said, that this is literature. It's suffused, it's structured beautifully, it's suffused with allusions. We already talked about Saul. We're not going to talk today, but allusions to the Joseph story and a couple of other earlier biblical texts. This is clearly not just someone writing down as things happen and sort of coming up with this as a chronicle. So I think on that level, the answer is fairly straightforward. Unfortunately, what's behind it is just unknowable to us. There are particular claims, like, there's a particular claim that Herodotus, who's a contemporary of the story of Xerxes, so Herodotus says the Persian kings marry only women from the 7 noble Persian families, which makes this whole, quote unquote beauty contest, that's actually not a beauty contest, very suspect. He also tells us that Xerxes, Ahasuerus, comes to the throne married to the queen Amestris, and she outlives him. So there's things like that are like, okay, so in the facts, clearly this is not straightforwardly what happened. On the other hand, is it possible that there was, on some scale, possibly imperial, possibly local, some genocidal plot against the Jews? Yeah, I mean, I don't know how we could possibly know that that didn't happen. And that certainly could have been the basis for this that sort of got spun into the book. So I have no particular, I'm really agnostic on the question of whether there's a historical reality behind it, because I just don't think we could possibly know the answer to that question. I think it's obvious that what we have is a book of like really impressive literature.
Thank you. So to your point about the key part of the story taking place on Pesach. Well, I couldn't, just a side note, I couldn't help notice, I think it was in the Ezekiel text that you brought, it said, I wrote it down, it said, Uvechema shvucha, an outpouring of fury, which we say in Haggadah, pour out your wrath onto the nations. Nice. So anyway, there's another Purim Pesach connection there, to the extent that you're rooting that or connecting that text to Purim. But anyway, to the question the person actually asked, he was asking if there any connection to Maccabees, which of course is later. He was saying that they didn't celebrate Sukkot that year because of everything going on. So there's like, here's Pesach not being celebrated, and then it turns into that lack of celebration turns into Purim, and later it's Sukkot not being celebrated, and those events turn into Chanukah.
That's a great point. I mean, we will actually, for entirely unrelated reasons, turn to the Maccabees in a bit. But no, I hadn't thought of that. It's a really lovely parallel. It's obviously not exactly the same in the sense that this is not, we didn't celebrate, therefore we have to have a new one. Or at least doesn't say so. Right? I mean, conceivably, that's what they were thinking. But we don't have that exact, but that is exactly, as you said, in Second Maccabees. And I don't know, maybe there's a commonality or even a model there. I don't know. Really interesting.
There are questions on so many different topics here. It's a little hard to choose. Let's see. Well, there were a few questions about the I hesitate to wade into this. Okay, actually, I'm going to defer to those instincts and ask you something else. Because why jump to Gaza right now, right? There were a couple of questions about the name Mordecai not being a Jewish name, and might he have been brought up somewhere else, or other kinds of, I mean, you talked about kind of rootedness in the diaspora, but I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to draw on, maybe part of this historicity question, kind of like real non-Jewish source material coming into the book.
Oh, interesting. The Mordecai name part, maybe I'll actually come to in just a moment, as soon as we rejoin the slides and get back to it. And yeah, I think maybe, but the other one also, I think we'll actually come back to more directly in just a couple of minutes. So, so some of that we'll tackle heads on.
So I have so many questions to sort through. Why don't we go back to your material, and I will.
Right. That sounds good. Bit. Yeah, because there have been a couple of things that we've alluded to that we'll pick up in some more detail. So maybe at the next pause will be a good time to take stock of everything. So if there's more things that are open, obviously, maybe those who have asked questions, if you feel like it should have been answered but it wasn't, so maybe at the next pause will be a good time to reiterate your question, and we can hopefully come back to it. Okay, so let's in fact rejoin this. So the next point that I sort of adumbrated earlier was a question of who is a Jew. This is really, I don't have too much to add to this. Just the note that Mordecai is called Yehudi repeatedly over the course of the Megillah is something that should not be glossed over. Not so many people are called Yehudi in Second Temple or even later until modern times. When you think about the Mishnah and the Talmud, the usual word for a Jew is not Yehudi, actually, it's Israel. And in Second Temple times, a Yehudi, or in Aramaic, Yehudai, or Yehudae in the plural, is a Judean. It's someone who lives in Judah, someone who is from Judah, but Mordecai has none of those qualifications. He's from the tribe of Benjamin, and he's introduced Ish Yehudi, but I want to look at this verse in a little bit of detail because it's so important how un-Judean he is. So Ish Yehudi haya b'Shushan Hibirah. In the fortress Shushan lived a Jew by the name of Mordecai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Asher hogla mirushalayim im hagola asher hoglata im Yechonia melech Yehuda asher hagla Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel, who had been exiled from Jerusalem in the group that was carried into exile along with King Jeconiah of Judah, which had been driven into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Now, technically, the who had been exiled is ambiguous, and lots of readers have sort of intuitively taken that to be Mordecai, that Mordecai was born in Jerusalem and he had been exiled. In other words, the grammar is, there was a Jew by the name of Mordecai, son of blah, 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 who had been exiled. Right? But there's a couple of reasons why that makes no sense, mostly historically. So whether or not there is a historical reality behind Esther, the history of Esther makes good sense. And the chronology makes good sense. There's no numbers in here that are ridiculous. And we already mentioned that the story of Esther, so this is the 7th year of, or Esther becomes queen in the 7th year of Achashverosh, 7th year of Xerxes. Xerxes is a real person. He comes to the throne in 485. So let's just take this as a hypothesis that the story is taking place in 470, or she becomes queen in 478 BCE. Then it's 5 years later that the whole Haman genocide thing happened. So 473 BCE. It doesn't really matter what numbers exactly. The point is the destruction of a temple and the exile was in 586, 115 years ago. So obviously Mordecai, if he was exiled from Jerusalem, is not hanging around in Shushan 115 years later. On the other hand, I won't bore you with it, but I can show you people who are like, oh, the book of Esther is obviously fiction because look, it says that Mordecai was exiled from Jerusalem, and yet he's there in the reign of Xerxes 115 years later, which is not a stupid point, except that the grammar bears a different reading, which I think is just easier, which is Mordecai, the son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, who was exiled from Jerusalem. In other words, it wasn't Mordecai, it was his great-grandfather, which of course chronologically makes very good sense. So if you think of a generation being, 25, 30 years, so his great-grandfather was exiled more than a century ago. Mordecai, though, and this is why I want to emphasize this, Mordecai is absolutely a native son of Shushan, of Persia. His name, so it's interesting, right? His great-grandfather Kish, that's a Hebrew name. His grandfather Shim'i, Hebrew name. His father Yair, Hebrew name. His cousin Hadassah has a Hebrew name. Her parents have a Hebrew name. But his name, as far as we know, he has only one, right? We don't know if he has a Hebrew name. No one tells us that he also has a Hebrew name. Unlike Hadassah Esther, Mordecai only has the name Mordecai, and as you said in the question, that's a very, very Babylonian name. Like at its root, it comes from the god Marduk. It doesn't mean that he worships Marduk or that anyone worships Marduk. You could talk about names that we have in English that come from Roman gods that people bear without having to worship those gods. So I don't think it means anything in particular about his religion, but it certainly means that his name is really, really not a Jewish name. Now, that makes it even more interesting than that Hadassah Esther has two names, right? She has the Hebrew name Hadassah and the Persian name Esther. We only hear the name Hadassah once, right? We get the name Hadassah and then it drops out. She's never called Hadassah again. So it's as if she has this identity, but she's never going to use that identity. That's not Hadassah. She's Esther for the rest of the book. Mordecai is introduced as Mordecai. And again, fourth generation in diaspora, so that makes good sense. Of course, they have Babylonian or Persian names by that point. But this is the one and only mention of Jerusalem. This is the one and only Jew in the book. And again, he's not from Judah. He's not a native son of Judah. He's not from the tribe of Judah. He's never been to Judah. He's never visited Judah. He is a Persian through and through. And yet he is an Ish Yehudi. And this, I think, has to be seen as a polemical point on the part of the authors, on the part of the author of the Book of Esther. Like, who is a Jew? This guy's a Jew. Now, you can imagine someone like Ezra and Nehemiah being like, what do you mean Mordecai's a Jew? Mordecai has never been to Jerusalem. He's never prayed. He's never, take a stand on this, but he's never eaten kosher. I don't know if he keeps Shabbat. I don't know anything about it. Like, what makes him a Jew? This is the worst Jew I've ever seen. And Esther's like, no, that's a Jew. He is loyal to the Jews. He puts his life on the line and he works for the Jews. That's a Jew. What else do you want? Now, of course, Ezra and Nehemiah would be like, there's a lot else I want, right? I want pure blood. I want return to Jerusalem, right? I want concrete actions that are religious and theological in nature in order to be Yehudi. But the Book of Esther is like, no, Yehudi here has nothing to do with religiosity, it has nothing to do with theology. Right, all of later on in chapter 9, we read that many of the non-Jews are mityahadim. They're acting like Jews. What does it mean they're acting like Jews? It means they're going over to the Jewish side. It doesn't mean that they're saying Shema twice a day or praying in the direction of Jerusalem. It just means they're loyal to the Jews. That's what it means to be a Jew in the book, in sort of the worldview of the Book of Esther. So that's an Ish Yehudi. All right, a couple of points I'll do quickly. When we get the introduction of Shushan, we get these, actually if we're following in the Parashat HaShavua these days, these words will sound very familiar. Chur karpasu tchelet achuz b'chavle butz v'argaman. You're like, I've read these before. And commentators have noticed for a long time that the descriptions of the palace in chapter 1 of Esther are reminiscent. This is an old commentary, 1908, you see, by Lewis Patton. It says the author has in mind the structure of the tabernacle in Exodus 26 to 27, but there is no hint that he means this to be an allegory of the messianic feast that God will make for his people. So you might get a sense of what religion that this particular commentator belongs to. But the allusion to the tabernacle is clear. If you're talking about boots and argaman, chur karpaset chelet, this is all from the temple, from the tabernacle. And I think that the author of Esther is saying, that's right, because actually the one and only mention of Jerusalem is here. Mordecai's great-grandfather was exiled from Jerusalem. Jerusalem is no longer the center of Jewish life. Where do all the important things happen in Jewish life? They happen here, in Susa. This is where the fate of the Jews is going to be decided. It doesn't matter how many Jews worship at the Jerusalem temple, which, by the way, is standing during the days of Esther. It doesn't matter what's going on there. What matters is who's in the halls of power in Susa. So you want to talk about the temple. The real temple has shifted. Now it's off in the east. Now it's over in Susa. Maybe I'll skip this for time's sake. And I'll sort of just to bridge to the next section, I want to say that the political overtones of the Book of Esther, different people have perceived different parts of it, but Esther being a diaspora book. In other words, a book that's not just coming from and describing the diaspora, but seems to really take diaspora quite seriously, doesn't seem to think that Jerusalem is all that important, that the temple is all that important, that David's all that important, or even that God's all that important, has been noticed by a lot of writers. So this is one example that it's a short pamphlet. The only copy that I know of is in the National Library of Israel, where this copy is from. And you can see actually most of the interesting stuff here is just in the title. So it's called Shnei Moadim, 2 festivals. It's a little pamphlet. Let me just point out the publisher here at the bottom left. This is published by Beitar in Poland, Warsaw, Adar, 1937. So of course, in retrospect, this is tragic and almost ironic. Ironic sounds too light for what we know to have happened. But Warsaw, 1937, Beitar is the revisionist Zionist movement founded by Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky, the more militant stream of Zionism that was being discussed and debated among Zionists in certainly the pre-war era. And so this guy, Israel Epstein, edits on behalf of Beitar a little pamphlet called 2 Festivals. 1, Yud Aleph Adar. Now, Yud Aleph Adar is the anniversary of the Battle of Tel Chai, in which Trumpeldor died, going back 30 years before this. But this symbol of fighting for one's homeland. So Yud Aleph Adar, Semel HaYahadut HaMechudeshet, is the symbol of the renewed Judaism. 2, Purim, Semel HaYahadut HaGalutit. And Purim is the symbol of diaspora Judaism. And actually, most of the pamphlet, which is not very long, 30 pages or so, consists of a plea to stop putting so much effort into Purim, which after all is for diaspora Jews, not really us anymore. That's for Jews who need to intermarry and work behind the scenes to manipulate the powers that be in order to defeat their enemies, whereas we today don't have to do that. We don't need Esther anymore. We need Trumpeldor. We need someone who's going to pick up a gun and fight against the enemies. And this is something that needs to be emphasized at the expense of Purim. And so the whole pamphlet is down with Purim, up with the 11th of Adar, celebrating Tel Chai. And I love this phrase, Purim, the symbol of the diaspora Judaism. Because of course, for the author here, for Epstein, this is like the worst thing you could possibly call Purim. For some readers, that's what makes it an amazing day, right? Like where else do we have a Jewish festival that celebrates diaspora? But that perception that Purim is a diaspora holiday, and it's not just, again, geographic in diaspora, but ideologically diaspora, that's something that's loomed quite large. So let me pause here before we turn to the next section, which will be evidence from ancient texts that there too it was perceived as a diaspora holiday and therefore was a source of annoyance or even animosity for some readers. Let's pause here for some questions, and then we'll move to the last section.
Great, thank you. So we could spend. You tell me when you want to move on, because we could spend the rest of the time.
Yeah, let's say at 2. We'll go back.
Okay. Okay. So there was some surprise by your comment about the temple still standing when Esther was written. And I was going to ask you a different question that came in, which I thought was a great question. Someone was saying, what do you mean when you say that Pesach wasn't celebrated that year? There wasn't a temple around to go to. They weren't doing, the Passover sacrifice, or maybe this person just meant the temple was far away, but, it's too early for a Seder that's developed by the rabbis later. There's no Torah reading yet, right? So maybe there was some matzah, we don't know. So the person was saying, like, what exactly wasn't celebrated? And how does it, right? If Pesach wasn't then what it is for us today, is it all that significant? And then, I don't know, I was relating that to the sort of, whoa, the temple was still standing question.
Yeah, great. I mean, yeah, I tried to slip that by everyone, right? So the truth is, that's actually an interesting one. We don't have time to fully unpack it. The chronology is actually totally straightforward. Like I don't have to do any work here, right? You think about who Xerxes is. And again, he's a real person. So whether or not the story happened, which we can put aside, the setting is very straightforward. So Xerxes, Google him, and he reigns from 485 to 465 BCE. His father is Darius. Darius's father is Cambyses. Cambyses' father is Cyrus. So this is the fourth king of Persia to rule over the Persian Empire, right? Since the Persian Empire has taken over the world. The temple was dedicated back in the second year of Darius. It's very explicit in other biblical texts. So given the kings as we know them to have reigned, it's not a subtle point. Like, it's really straightforward that anything in the reign of Xerxes is after the dedication of the temple. What makes this sort of more fraught, and the reason that people express surprise over it, I'm going to surmise, is because the rabbis of the Talmud who don't know Herodotus, which is actually interesting because they could know Herodotus, right? I mean, obviously, they could have theoretically picked up Herodotus and gotten some Persian history, but they don't. They have no understanding of the chronology of the Persian Empire. And so everything that they do about the chronology of the Persian Empire comes from the Bible. In other words, what I just told you, methodologically, I say, like, well, I already know who Xerxes is. Now let me slot in the biblical stories, right? Like, it says the second year of Xerxes. I know when that is. But the rabbis are like, I don't know. Let me read the Bible and figure out how long the Persians reigned and which kings were which. So they wind up with all sorts of things which, from our modern perspective, are just non-starters historically, including saying things like Darius and Cyrus are the same person, maybe also Ahasuerus is the same person, maybe Artaxerxes, who shows up in Esther and Ezra, is also the same person. Also saying that Ahasuerus might be before Cyrus. The Midrash says that Cyrus was actually Esther's son. There's all sorts of things to unpack there. Like, it's actually fascinating that in the book of Esther, Esther doesn't have a child. Right? There is no future in the book of Esther. Which, when you think about like Disney movies, it's like the happily, you live happily ever after, right? It's very rare that, like, oh, and they had a child. I mean, in the older ones, they have a child. Obviously, what else would a woman be doing how could you have happily ever after without a child at the end? But at some point, Disney was like, no, just true love is all you need, right? So in the book of Esther, it's also not about a child. It's about, we've survived. I don't know what the next generation is going to be. We're not talking about the next generation. We're just talking about this generation. That's actually ideologically significant. But the Midrash is like, no, Cyrus is Esther's child, which of course allows it to be like, oh, the Esther story is a prequel to the building of the Beit HaMikdash, to the second temple. So there's a lot going on there, but on like straightforward historical grounds, yeah, the temple's standing in the days of Esther for like a half a century already. It's been functioning, which makes it shocking that there's not a word in Esther about the temple, right? The fact that when it says 127 provinces, that includes Judea and includes the Jews of Jerusalem with their temple, like, they're one of 127 from the perspective of Esther. Like, they don't get any special treatment. So it's definitely worthy of noticing that, but it's actually not a controversial point. It's just a fascinating point. What would Pesach have looked like? I don't know. Yeah, I was being obviously a little tongue-in-cheek with we've cleaned our houses already, and we have from Elephantine, which is a long story in and of itself, but we actually have Aramaic letters from the same time that talk about the celebration of Passover in terms of not having chametz and being pure. So there would have been some Passover, but what it looked like is irrelevant for my purposes right now.
Right. And it really is shocking, like the way you explained it, that such a deliberate omission. So related to that, the other kind of cluster of questions related to Pesach, I think are connected to what you were just saying. Several people asked, is the idea here, you mentioned the absence of God in the text, is the idea here that not only, we are sort of diasporically centered and happy that way, but also, maybe over there or back then, God solved the problems, and today, like, we're in charge of our fate and we solve our problems. Is that
Yeah, I think that's
sort of
a
subversive, like almost anti-God or pro-human agency message being sent here?
So I'll tell you what I'm confident in, and I'll tell you what I'm less confident in. I think that's a very good summary. The part that I'm less confident in is the happy part. I actually don't know if the author of Esther is happy about this. I think the author thinks this is true and realistic. Is it ideal? That I don't know. In other words, I think the author is saying, like, look, I can read the book of Joshua, and I can read the book of Samuel, and I can read the book of Exodus, and I think these are great, right? It's a different place, a different time, long time ago. God's overtly showing up and doing miracles. Later on, we have our own temple, we have our own capital, we have political autonomy. None of that is true anymore. Now, does he say, I wish it were true and hopefully one day it will be true? Or does he say, guys, you got to get over it? Like, that's a long time ago. We don't do that anymore. Like, we're happy here. There is no future going back. That I don't know. But I think for the time being, and again, I think the lack of a past to a large degree and the absolute lack of a future in the story is very, very important. The story really, I mean, when I said earlier that the Jews at the end of the story are exactly where they were at the beginning of the story, that's not a trivial point. So we've lasted one more generation, right? And a generation, so Xerxes happens to rule for 20 years. I mean, we know that historically. If you can survive 20 years in relative security in this totally crazy, unpredictable Persian world where you never know who's going to decide to kill the Jews this week, that's not a small thing. Now, I don't have time to fully unpack this, but there is a lot of a whole constellation of allusions in Esther to the Joseph story. Right? So Joseph's great for all sorts of reasons. A diaspora Jew, helps his brothers, all sorts of different things that sort of help the story of Esther. But every Jew would have known what the sequel to the Joseph story was, right? You turn the page, literally turn the page. Joseph died. You turn the page and it says, there's a new king in Egypt who doesn't remember Joseph, and really quickly all the Jews are slaves, right? And their kids are getting massacred. So you have to ask that at the end of Esther also. Like, great, so Mordecai and Esther are fantastic, but turn the page. Like, what happens next? After Xerxes is not the king, and Esther is not the queen, and Mordecai is not the second in command, like, has anything changed? Is there any reason to think this isn't just going to repeat itself next generation? And the short answer is no. But for this generation, we've done what we can. There really isn't more that you can hope for in exile. So barring an autonomous polity centered in Jerusalem and God's overt involvement, this is what we have. This is life. Again, I don't know whether this is the ideal life for the author, but I think it is life for the author.
It's fascinating. So why don't you keep going, and we'll save the questions for the end.
Thank you. Okay, fine. So we'll do sort of basically one more point. And the point I want to show you is that many of the thoughts and reactions that you can see in modern times in response to some of the Book of Esther actually existed in ancient times also. So there's a lot that we could talk about, of sources that we could talk about, but I just want to focus on one, which is called the Greek version of Esther. I'll tell you in a second why that's not the best term, but it is in fact the Greek version of Esther in the sense that we don't have it in Hebrew. We have it only in Greek. You could also call it the Catholic version of Esther. You could call it the Christian version of Esther until Luther. But the reason I don't like the terms Greek or Catholic or Christian is because this is actually a Jewish version of Esther. We actually know where and when it was made because we have what's called a colophon in the text. This is not a scribal colophon. We sometimes get manuscripts where a scribe says, I, Aaron, sitting here in 2024, blah, 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 did this, right? This is an author's colophon, which ends as follows. You have it in front of you. In the 4th year of the reign of Ptolemy and Cleopatra, Dositheus, who said he was a priest and a Levite, and his son Ptolemy brought the above letter about Purim, which they said was authentic. Lysimachus, son of Ptolemy of Jerusalem, translated it. So we could do a little bit of historical calculations. Ptolemy and Cleopatra, who are these people? Of course, we know, unfortunately, what do we have, like 13 Ptolemies, and I don't remember how many Cleopatras. So how many Ptolemies and Cleopatras are actually married to each other? And where did this come? So it comes from Jerusalem to Alexandria. And we do a little bit of calculation and we figure out that the 4th year of this Ptolemy and this Cleopatra is about, like, I'm just going to say 76 BCE. It's brought from Jerusalem to Alexandria. Now, 76 BCE, the first thing I should just say, this is pre-Christian, right? It's 100 years before, 100-something years before Jesus' crucifixion. So obviously it's a Jewish book. That's not a controversial point. But it is a very important point. So I'm going to say it's the Greek version of Esther, but it's a Greek Jewish version of Esther. Now, what's happening in 76 BCE in Jerusalem? Remember, the book says that Lysimachus of Jerusalem translated it. And it was brought by these other two people, priests from Jerusalem. They said it was authentic. So what's going on in Jerusalem in 76 BCE? Well, it's right in between Alexander Jannaeus, Alexander Yanai, and Salome Alexandra, Shlom Tzion. Both these people have streets named after them in Jerusalem, which makes them very important, but they're also very important historically. The most important thing to say is that these are monarchs of the Hasmonean dynasty. These are Hasmonean kings. Alexander Jannaeus is the first one to actually call himself king on his coins. And then Shlom Tzion, who is remembered in all sorts of ways. For coins, we have historical documents. Josephus tells us a lot about her, but both of these people, she's remembered in rabbinic literature. Really, really important characters. But again, what I want to just point out, the most important point is not the specific names, but that this book is coming from, so this Greek version of Esther is coming from Hasmonean Jerusalem. Now, a few minutes ago, 10, 15 minutes ago, he said, what would Beitar revisionist Zionists think about the book of Esther? And we're like, well, they wouldn't like some parts of it. So I can ask you the same question. What would Hasmoneans think about the book of Esther? And you get much the same answer. They will not like Esther at all. Think about the Hasmoneans, their ideology, what they treasured, what they valued, what they fought for, what they died for. Actually, their whole goal in life is as different from Esther as you can imagine. So I don't know who mentioned, but Rabbi Andelman channeled the question earlier about the new festival of Chanukah, which was modeled on the festival of Sukkot that they had missed while they were fighting. Let's just talk about the festival of Chanukah. So the Maccabees, of course, say, we have a new festival. It's all about rededicating the temple, which we have fought and died for, right? God has saved all his people and has restored to all of us our holy land, the kingship, the priesthood, the temple services. So that verse 17 here, holy land, kingship, priesthood, temple services, 4 things that they're celebrating. None of them, of course, are reflected in the book of Esther, just as he promised us in his law. He's rescued us from terrible evils, purified the temple. We're confident that in his mercy, he will soon gather us to his holy temple from every nation under the sun. So the end game of the Hasmonean rebellion was the temple, was political authority in Jerusalem. Again, all things that Esther is not interested in. I won't do this in detail, but the very first stories of Jewish martyrdom that we have in Jewish literature are in the books of Maccabees. So we have stories in 2nd Maccabees 6 and 7, and they're pretty terrible to read. One of them, the second one in chapter 7, is the mother of her 7 children who sequentially give their lives rather than give in to the king. In chapter 6, we have an old man named Elazar who martyred himself rather than eat pork. Now, there's no martyrdom in the book of Esther, right? That's sort of obvious. But there doesn't have to be martyrdom in every story. Where would there be martyrdom? Well, the Hasmoneans would certainly say, wait, there's something really important about the book of Esther that you're ignoring, right? We haven't talked yet in more detail about this fact that Esther's intermarried. That's not okay. One may not intermarry. Now, there's an open question as to how much choice Esther had, but the Hasmoneans would be like, that's a nonsense question. There's always a choice, right? There's actually, Sartre says the same thing. There's always a choice. There's always the choice of martyrdom. Sartre says suicide, but the Hasmoneans would say there's always a choice of martyrdom. I can always die. So she was taken against her will. There's no against you. So say no. And if they run you through, they run you through. Isn't that better? That's what Elazar did. That's what all the kids did. When something's really important, you die rather than violate it. What is this? I have no choice. There's no such thing as I have no choice. So die. And that is as far from the ethos as Esther as you can possibly imagine, right? So here's the woman and her 7 sons. This is she is like an anti-Esther, right? Like, my children should die and I'm proud of them for dying rather than committing idolatry. or eating pork in the story, in the version here. The Talmud's version has them Korean idolatry. The story in Second Maccabees has them eating pork. And as my favorite line in this chapter is actually verse 42, which say, I have said enough about the Jews, which is always a good line, right? Now, all of what we've seen about Esther would offend the Hasmoneans. So the absence of God, the centrality of the temple in Jerusalem, lack of resistance in the name of religion, all of this would offend the Hasmoneans. So when we read that there is a version of the book of Esther coming from Hasmonean Jerusalem, we're like, really? The Hasmoneans liked the book of Esther? They translated it? They're disseminating it? And the answer is yes, but not unaltered. They changed the book of Esther. They added things to the book of Esther. And there are what are conventionally called the 6 additions to the book of Esther. We're not going to have time to look at these in a lot of detail. So if you want to look at them online, just Google something like Greek additions to Esther. There's lots of translations of them online. I'm going to just run through a couple of short details and so dilate on one of them. So the six additions sort of broken up into 3 pairs. At the beginning, the very, very beginning. So the book actually starts this way. Second year of the king Ahasuerus the Great, on the first day of Nisan, Mordecai had a dream. So in this version of the book, we actually get Mordecai's introduction before we get the whole banquet. He was a Jew and so on, and he has a dream about 2 dragons who fight against each other, and they're going to bring destruction to the world. And then there is a tiny spring of water which grows into a great river, which eventually somehow pacifies the world. That's the beginning. The end is very, very end of the book. Addition F is that Mordecai says, now I understand my dream from the beginning. Haman and I were the 2 dragons. Esther was the spring of water. We would have destroyed the world, but Esther brought peace to the world. The details are really fascinating. All I'll say right now is that this, from the beginning, makes the book a much more biblical sounding book. Who has dreams in the Bible? Joseph has dreams in the Bible. So we're like, oh, this is like Joseph, right? Mordecai is like Joseph. Daniel is the great dream interpreter of the Bible. So now Mordecai is more like Daniel. And more importantly than what it does to Mordecai is what it tells us about the story and God's involvement. Because now we're told from the very beginning, this whole thing was preordained by God. There was a dream. It was a prophecy. It was all God's plan. This is not just the vicissitudes of history, capricious nature of life in the exile. This is God had preordained and foretold that this was going to happen. So this makes the book into a much more theologically acceptable book. And again, this is added into the book. I don't know exactly when, but it's certainly in the version that the Hasmoneans in Jerusalem in the 1st century BCE have. So when they have the book of Esther, they're reading it with the dream at the beginning and the dream interpretation at the end. 2 additions that I won't talk about are additions B and E. So they're the texts of the letter. So in the book of Esther, Haman sends out this genocidal letter and says, ordaining a genocide. In the Greek version, the copy of the letter is there, not authentic, but presumably not authentic. Who knows? This is what it says. And then addition E is the letter that Mordecai and Esther send out at the end. They say, again, in the Hebrew version, it just says they sent out a letter to all the Jews across the provinces. So in the Greek version, it says, and here is a copy of the letter. More important for us right now are additions C and D. So these are bracketed right in the middle between, in Hebrew, what we have is chapter 4 and chapter 5. So chapter 4, you remember, is a dialogue between Mordecai and Esther, and Mordecai is trying to convince Esther to do something, save the Jews. And chapter 5 is Esther actually going to the king. In between those 2 chapters, we have these 2 additional segments in the Greek version. Prayer of Mordecai. Mordecai prayed to the Lord, calling to remembrance all the works of the Lord. This is already fascinating, right? Because we're like, there's no God in the book of Esther. God is all over the Greek version of Esther. There's prayers, there's a Jewish law, there's explicit mentions of God even in other places. So the book in the Greek version is far, far more religious than it is in the Hebrew version. And then Esther. Esther also prays to God. But here I want to actually look at just a couple of details of what she says. She took off her splendid apparel and put on the garments of distress and mourning. Instead of costly perfume, she covered her head with ashes and dung. She utterly humbled her body every part that she loved to adorn, she covered with her tangled hair. And she prayed and she said, "Oh, my Lord, you only are our king." Now, remember, she's married to a literal king, right? So when she says, "You're our only king," that's different from like other Jews saying that. "You are our only king. Help me, who am alone, who have no helper, for my danger is in my hand. Ever since I was born, I have heard in the tribe of my family that you, O Lord, took Israel out of all the nations, our ancestors from among all the forebears, for an everlasting inheritance. And now we have sinned." I'm going to skip a little bit. We need your help. "Don't surrender your scepter to what has no being." Skip a little bit more. I'm going to skip to here, verse 15. "You have knowledge of all things. You know that I hate the splendor of the wicked and abhor the bed of the uncircumcised and of any alien. You know my necessity, that I abhor the sign of my proud position, which is upon my head on days when I appear in public, in other words, my crown. I abhor it like a filthy rag. I don't wear it on the days when I'm at leisure. Your servant has not eaten at Haman's table, not honored the king's feast, or drunk the wine of libations. Your servant has had no joy here since the day when I was brought here until now, except in you, O Lord, God of Abraham. O God, whose might is over all, hear the voice of the despairing, save us from the hands of evildoers, and save me from my fear." So this paints an entirely different portrait of the character of Esther than we would have gotten from the Hebrew version. In this picture, Esther is tortured by the fact that she's intermarried. She despises the bed of the uncircumcised. She hates it. Every day of her intermarried life is a source of deep despair for her. She only wishes she could be a good Jew, but unfortunately, she has no choice. So, for the author, the original author of Hebrew Esther, this is almost exactly the opposite of what he wants to say, I think. But for some later reader who is really bothered by the fact that Esther is intermarried and doesn't even seem remorseful about it, right? Like maybe when she's the queen, she can't do anything about it because she's keeping her Jewish identity secret. But at the end of the book, when everyone knows she's queen, why don't we at least read that she like had all the kitchens of the palace be kosher, so she can eat only kosher food, and ordain that Sabbath be kept throughout Persia. But there's nothing like that in the entire book, right? So the author of the Greek edition's like, that's got to be in there, right? Esther might do whatever she does, but at least she needs to apologize for it. She needs to be tortured by it. She needs to despair about the fact that she is intermarried. So that's what we get here. And then the next scene has Esther going into the king, and immediately fainting. So this is edition D. Now, I'm including this here because you get this a lot in art. You actually get these scenes of Esther fainting. I'll give you a couple more in a second. But I just want to make the point that those who recognize this scene, right? If you look at this and be like, Esther fainting in front of the king, sure, a typical motif. That's not in the Hebrew book, but it is in the Greek version, right? So the Greek version was a Jewish version, becomes the Christian version, and then Luther takes it out. He compares the Greek version to the Hebrew version. He's like, wait a second, all these passages are not in the Hebrew version. They shouldn't be in the Bible. So at this point, it's just the Catholic version. But certainly pre-Luther, and Catholics even post-Luther, they know Esther with these additions. And it's not an addition, it's just part of the Book of Esther. So there's a whole stream of tradition that thinks about Esther in a way that's actually very, very different than the way most Jews think about Esther. So it's true in some artwork. I'll show you a couple more examples in a second. But it's true also, for example, the crypto Jews, Marranos, who take Esther as a patron saint for obvious reasons, right? A crypto Jew looking for pre-modern, so to speak, Jewish heroes who hid their Jewish faith, but that was all okay. It was for a good purpose. They find Esther, and we have all these crypto Jewish texts that are about Esther, literally beatify her, and they only know Esther in the Latin version. So the Marrano version of Esther also includes Esther fainting in front of the king and Esther praying and so on. So this is Tintoretto, this is Veronese, Esther before Achashverosh. I don't know, this is like the least dramatic fainting ever, but Guercino, later on in Rome. My favorite, Artemisia Gentileschi, which happens to be in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, but also bold in its colors and spare and austere in its detail. Just an amazingly evocative picture. And you also see the king like starting to get up to help her. There's been some thought among critics of the art and also of the book. Is she really fainting? Is she manipulating the king? I don't know. But the key for us is that all of these depictions actually depict an Esther who is entirely different than the Esther of the Hebrew text. This is Esther as depicted in the Hasmonean, eventually Greek version of the Book of Esther, which this part is probably straight out of Hellenistic novellas, but more importantly for us are the ideological points. This is an Esther who is tortured about being intermarried, who has just given this amazingly poignant prayer to God about how she cares not a whit for the crown on her head. All she wants is salvation from the God of Abraham. And this is an Esther who is crafted to repudiate the Esther of the Hebrew text. That's the whole point of these editions, is to say, look, the Esther of the Hebrew text is deeply problematic. So if you like her, you're deeply problematic. We need an Esther who's going to reflect our values better. And so the value for us in this Greek version is not only in giving us a different portrait of Esther, but also in laying bare these really profound ideological questions that were being debated among Second Temple Jews. Some Second Temple Jews wrote the Book of Esther and thought it was great. We even have it in our canon. Some Second Temple Jews got the Book of Esther and recoiled from it. Like, this is a terrible book. If we're going to have a Book of Esther, it needs to be fixed up. And they add in some dreams, they add in God, they add in prayers, and they change the portrait of the Book of Esther, of the character of Esther as we have her, apologizing for all of the sins and violations and intermarriage that would have bothered these readers so much. So that is where I will end, and hopefully we have some time for some last questions.
Thank you. Okay, so a couple questions that came in earlier, but are really directly on exactly what you were just saying. Someone was asking, is the book, sorry, okay, distracted by something outside. Is the book not just maybe sort of pro-diaspora, or as you put it earlier, sort of, well, here's where we are, so let's just accept it, kind of centeredness in diaspora, but could you read it as pro-secular? Someone was asking, kind of is part of the distance from the temple that, we're just not, like, this is an ethnic identity for us, not so much a religious one. That was before you even went into all of these Greek editions. And then someone asked more recently, why, if we were going to stick with the Book of Esther and canonize it into the Hebrew Bible, like why would we not have done it with the more religious or the expanded version with all of these Greek editions that you shared with us?
Those are both great questions. The first one, yeah, I think it's an open question. So Michael Fox, who's maybe some of you know him, he is retired now. He was professor of biblical studies at the University of Wisconsin, a Reform rabbi also, and he has what I think is the best commentary on the Book of Esther. It's called something like Character and Ideology in the Book of Esther. It's an academic book, but he's such an insightful reader. And when he talks about the theology of the Book of Esther, he reads it as sort of explicitly agnostic. That the author is saying, I don't know. I've read all those biblical stories. I know how God operated in the past. I can tell you what I see, but I can't really tell you what's behind it. I can't come out and say, right? I can't come out and say at the end, like Joseph does, at the end of Joseph's story, Joseph says to his brothers, well, we all know that God actually orchestrated this whole thing, right? You could have done that in the Book of Esther. You could have had the whole book as we have it. And at the very end, like chapter 10 is 3 verses long, right? There's plenty of space left to have like a proper chapter. So you could have had like Mordecai get up and say, now it's all clear. God preordained this and God orchestrated our redemption, right? That would have been the easiest thing in the world to do. But it doesn't happen. And for Fox, that's because the author is saying, look, I'm going to lead you down the road to see that it's possible to read this as God's involvement, but I don't know if it's God's involvement. I just can't be sure. Until God outs God's self and does something like splits a sea, I just have no idea if it's God or not. It might be God. It might be just the good fortune of Jewish history. As Haman's wife Zeresh says, if you've started to fall before the Jews, you're never going to overcome them. You're like, why? Like, why not? And you're like, I don't know. But that's the way fortune works, right? Fate works for the Jews. And Fox, I think, he reads it as sort of explicitly agnostic. Like, I can show you history. I can open the possibility that this is divine involvement, but I just can't say whether it is or not. And I think that's quite good. I can't do better than that. I think that's a good formulation. In terms of the canonization, this is a problem because we don't know how we actually got the canon of the Bible, which is very frustrating. So I think it's a great observation that we ought to know more about this. And I think it's a great sort of opening for thinking like, well, who would have canonized this less religious version of the Bible? Does that mean the Bible comes from the Eastern diaspora? Possible, not likely, possible. I have this maybe, I don't think it's far-fetched, but it's hard to prove theory that the canonization of the Bible took place under the reign of Herod. Not that Herod himself cared that much about the Bible, but that under his reign, the politics would have been much more anti-Hasmonean, collaborating with the powers that be and seeing that like actually who's in charge is Rome, not so much what happens in Jerusalem. Of course, Herod does build a temple, Temple Mount as we know it. So the temple itself, maybe he would have liked more of a mention of, but I don't know exactly, but I think that's a time and place that we might look to for where the book might have been canonized in its original form that wouldn't have corrected for all the Hasmoneans. But it's just a thought. I can't really nail that down.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so in our last 2 minutes, so let's not talk about Gaza per se, but there was a question quite a while back that I think is worth coming back to. You referred to the the armed conflict at the end of the book as defensive, and it seems to me that in recent years it's sort of in vogue to when all these different Jewish organizations send out their pre-Purim learning emails to kind of bash the 9th chapter of Esther and dissociate from what seems like gratuitous violence. So a couple people noted that you referred to it as defensive, and I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, so very, very briefly, there's two things I would want to say. First of all, there are textual questions there about how exactly to read some of the details that make it more or less defensive, depending on how you read certain details. So that, I don't have time to go through the details, but for example, like Robert Gordis's commentary has a great discussion of some of the textual issues there. And if he's right, then it really is sort of explicitly defensive. So that's one point. But it is obviously very violent. And there is also this request that you can't get around where Esther says, could we just have one more day to massacre our enemies, right? Which is like, it might be defensive in the broad sweep of things, but it's obviously offensive in the narrow scope. So I'll say, there's a book by Elliot Horowitz of blessed memory called Reckless Rights, where he, among other things, traces the association of Purim with violent ideas in Jewish practice and memory. And you get things like burning Haman in effigy, but Haman looks a lot like a bishop, things like that. And you get a lot of it in early Middle Ages, even late antiquity, down through the Middle Ages, early modern times. The terrifying turn of modern times is that that's all harmless because the Jews couldn't actually do anything to the bishop, meaning they needed a release. So you burn the bishop in effigy, you know what? No one's actually hurt. If anyone's going to get hurt, it's going to be the Jews. So in the scheme of things, like, okay, let them have their religious fantasy once a year. Obviously, it takes a much more terrifying turn when you put a machine gun in the hands of those people who are burning people in effigy. And the single most horrifying example of this is Baruch Goldstein, who chose Purim to go to the mosque in Hebron, in the Ma'arat HaMachpelah, and massacre 29 innocent Palestinians who were praying there. And he did it on Purim on purpose. This is not, it wasn't an accident. So the association of Purim with violence really has turned quite terrifying today. Again, there is a tradition there, but the tradition was harmless for about 1,500 years. When you marry it to real military and political might, then it suddenly becomes actually terrifying. So I think we really today do have to be much more scared of that, of what can be done with that 9th chapter. If you had asked me 300 years ago, like, isn't this terrible? I would have said, no, it's not so terrible. This powerless minority that gets massacred everywhere around the world, get kicked out of country after country, let them have their one chapter where they can fantasize about defeating all their enemies. But today it really is pretty terrifying. And we've seen, some specific examples where it's been tied to Purim. And of course, then there's the more general terrifyingness of what happens when you take ideas that were forged without power and actually put power in their hands. My friend, Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, head of Shalom Hartman Institute in North America, put it really brilliantly, I think, in a piece at some point, maybe 10 years ago, where he said that the first 8 chapters of Esther are about the terror of being powerless in exile. And the last chapter is about the terror of being powerful. And both of those are terrifying in different ways. We have to worry about the abuses that can come from being powerless and the abuses that can come from being powerful. And obviously, Esther itself doesn't actually give us a blueprint for navigating the two of them. It just gives us a terror of both sides.
Right. I was just about to say, and someone just put it in the chat as well, that what you were describing made me think of the whole conquest of the land in Joshua, which I remember, studying with an archaeologist who just, goes like one point after another, like the Jews weren't there the Israelites weren't there at this time. They didn't win this battle. This didn't happen. And her whole read of the book was it's sort of like to comfort this ancient people that their God didn't abandon them, because that was their only explanation for why things were going so poorly. The point being, the context matters so much, and we can't sort of take application and instruction out of ancient texts in a way that it doesn't belong in modern times. All right, so sorry to end on that sort of lower note, but what I wanted to say before is this session really, as the rabbis say, keep turning the Torah, because you'll turn it and turn it. You find newness in it at all times. That's what I felt like this session was. I learned so many things about a book that I've studied so much, and I know the same is true of everyone gathered here. So thank you so much for all of these insights and really new ways to think about this book that I'm sure we'll all be bringing into Purim with us a little under 2 weeks. Thank you for teaching us. We hope you come back again soon. And thanks to everyone for joining us. And I definitely hope all the other folks joining us come back soon as well, because we have a wonderful, wonderful session a week from today with Dr. Shira Billet, who is Assistant Professor of Jewish Thought and Ethics at JTS. Her session is called Law as a Moral Force, When President Truman and Chief Justice Warren Studied Talmud at JTS. Don't miss it. Thanks again to everyone for joining us today, to Dr. Koller for teaching. See you all again soon.